The piano had been out of tune for 3 days when Frank Sinatra finally walked into Studio B at Capitol Records at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March 1957, and everyone who'd been waiting since midnight, the orchestra, the engineers, the producer, the arrangers, looked up with a mixture of relief and exhaustion, because they'd been told the session would start at midnight, and here it was 2 hours and 17 minutes later, and nobody had dared to leave or complain or even ask where Sinatra was. They just waited in that expensive silence that happens when 23 musicians are on the clock at union rates, and the only person who can start the session hasn't shown up yet. Sinatra walked in alone. No entourage, no explanation, just Frank in a dark suit and loosened tie, carrying nothing but a pack of cigarettes and the kind of exhaustion that comes from not sleeping for days. And he walked past the control booth without acknowledging the engineer who'd stood up to greet him, walked past the orchestra without making eye contact with a single musician, walked straight to the piano where a young man named Bill Miller was sitting, hands resting on the keys but not playing, waiting. Miller was 29 years old, had been Sinatra's pianist for less than a year, was still learning the way Sinatra breathed between phrases, still figuring out when to follow and when to lead, still navigating the impossible task of accompanying someone who treated every song like a conversation and expected you to know what he was going to say before he said it. And when Sinatra stopped beside the piano and looked down at him, Miller felt his stomach tighten because he knew that look. Had seen it before when something was wrong, when Sinatra was about to explode or walk out or do something that would make tomorrow's headlines. "The piano's out of tune," Sinatra said, and his voice was quiet, flat, completely without inflection. Miller nodded. "I know. I told them. They said the tuner couldn't come until morning. And you didn't think to tell me. You weren't here to tell." Sinatra's jaw tightened. "So you just sat there for 2 hours knowing the piano was out of tune, knowing we couldn't record anything worth keeping, and you didn't think to call me. I called your house 3 times. Nobody answered. So you gave up." "I didn't give up. I told the producer. I told the engineer. I told everyone who would listen that we couldn't record with the piano like this." "And what did they say?" "They said we'd work around it. Use another instrument. Adjust in post-production." Sinatra looked up at the control booth where the producer, a man named Voyle Gilmore who'd worked with Sinatra for 5 years and knew better than to make excuses, was standing very still, watching through the glass. Sinatra pressed the intercom button. "Voyle, get down here." Gilmore came down within 30 seconds, walked onto the studio floor, stopped a few feet from the piano. "Frank, I can explain." "Explain what?" "Why you thought it was acceptable to start a recording session with an out-of-tune piano. The tuner wasn't available. We called 3 different companies. Nobody could come on short notice. So you decided to record anyway. We thought we could work around it. The piano isn't featured heavily in most of the arrangements." "The piano is featured in every arrangement," Sinatra interrupted, and his voice was still quiet, but there was something underneath now, something sharp. "Even when it's not playing, it's setting the harmonic foundation for everything else. You know that. I know you know that, so why are we having this conversation?" Gilmore looked at Miller, then back at Sinatra. "Frank, we're paying these musicians double time. We're paying the engineers. We're paying for the studio. If we don't record tonight, it's going to cost thousands of dollars to reschedule. And if we record tonight with a piano that's out of tune, it's going to cost me my reputation, which is worth more than thousands of dollars. Nobody will notice." "I'll notice," Sinatra said, and now his voice had gone very cold. "I'll notice every time I hear the playback. I'll notice every time someone plays the record. I'll notice for the rest of my life. And you want me to put my name on that because you didn't want to reschedule." Gilmore didn't answer. The studio was completely silent. 23 musicians sitting with their instruments, waiting to see what would happen next. Sinatra turned to Miller. "Can you play it?" "The piano? Yeah, I can play it, but it won't sound right." "How out of tune is it?" Miller played a chord, C major. It sounded close but wrong, like someone singing slightly flat. "The middle register is about a quarter tone off. The bass is worse. The treble is barely holding." Sinatra listened. Then he sat down on the piano bench next to Miller. "Slide over." Miller slid to the left. Sinatra put his hands on the keys, played the same chord, listened, played it again. "You're right," Sinatra said. "It's shot." He stood up, walked to the control booth intercom. "Voyle, call everyone. Tell them we're rescheduling." Frank, please, I'm not arguing about this. We're not recording tonight. Call the union. Tell them we're paying everyone for their time, but we're not using it. Send them home. Gilmore's face went pale. The label is going to lose their minds. Let them. Tell them it's my decision. Tell them I refuse to record with equipment that wasn't up to standard. Tell them whatever you want. But we're done here tonight. Moore looked like he wanted to argue, but something in Sinatra's face stopped him. He picked up the phone in the booth, started making calls. Sinatra turned back to the orchestra. "I'm sorry," he said, and his voice carried across the studio floor. "This is my fault. I should have checked the piano before we started. You guys did nothing wrong. You'll get paid for tonight. And when we reschedule, I'll make sure everything's perfect." The musicians didn't say anything, just started packing up their instruments. Within 20 minutes, the studio was empty except for Sinatra, Miller, and the engineer. Sinatra sat back down at the piano, played another chord, grimaced. "This is a $60,000 piano," he said to no one in particular. "Supposed to be the best in the city. Can't hold tune for a week." Miller didn't respond, just sat there. "You did the right thing," Sinatra said after a moment, telling them, trying to fix it. "Lot of good it did. You can't control whether people listen. You can only control whether you speak up. You spoke up, that matters. Does it? We still wasted everyone's night." Sinatra looked at him. "We didn't waste anything. We preserved something more important than one night of recording. We preserved the standard. You think those musicians are going home angry. They're going home knowing that Frank Sinatra won't settle for less than perfect. And next time we're in here, they're going to bring that same standard. That's worth more than whatever we would have recorded tonight." Miller nodded slowly. "Never thought of it that way. Most people don't. They think compromise is practical, efficient. But compromise on the small things and eventually you're compromising on everything. And then you wake up one day and you're making records you're ashamed of because you convinced yourself nobody would notice the difference." They sat there for a moment, the studio quiet around them, just the hum of the recording equipment and the distant sound of traffic outside. "Can I ask you something?" Miller said. "Yeah. Why did you come tonight? If you knew the piano was out of tune, if you knew we couldn't record, why show up at 2 in the morning?" Sinatra was quiet for a long time. Then, "Because I wanted to see if anyone would say anything. I wanted to see if you'd stand up and tell Voyle we couldn't work like this. Or if you just go along with it because that's easier. You were testing me. I was testing everyone. Voyle, the engineer, the musicians, but mostly you. Because you're the one sitting at this piano. You're the one who has to make it work even when it doesn't. And I needed to know if you'd fight for what's right or just do what you're told." Miller felt something cold in his chest. "What if I just played it? What if I'd gone along with recording tonight? Then I would have known you weren't the pianist I needed. And then what? Then I would have found someone else." Miller stared at the keys. "That's a hell of a lot of pressure to put on someone." "Yeah, it is. But that's the job. Not just playing the notes, making sure the notes are worth playing." Sinatra stood up, walked toward the exit, stopped, turned back. "We'll reschedule for Thursday, 10 p.m. Make sure the piano's tuned. If it's not, call me. I don't care what time it is, you understand?" "Yes." "Good, go home, get some sleep." Sinatra left. Miller sat alone at the piano for another 10 minutes. He thought about what Sinatra had said, about standards, about compromise, about the fact that Sinatra had shown up at 2 in the morning just to see if Miller would do the right thing. Finally, Miller stood up, walked to the phone in the control booth, called the piano tuner's emergency line, left a message saying he needed the piano at Capitol Records studio be tuned by Thursday at 9 p.m., no exceptions, and he'd pay double the normal rate if necessary. Then he went home. Thursday night, Miller arrived at the studio at 8:30 p.m. The piano tuner was just finishing. Miller sat down, played a scale, played a chord. It was perfect. Sinatra arrived at 9:47 p.m. He walked straight to the piano without greeting anyone, sat down, played the same chord Miller had tested, listened, looked up at Miller. "Good," he said. "That was all, just good." But Miller understood what it meant. The session started at 10:03 p.m. They recorded 7 songs in 4 hours. Every take was clean. Every performance was perfect. When they finished, Sinatra thanked the orchestra, thanked the engineer, and walked over to Miller. "You did well tonight," Sinatra said. "Thanks. Not just the playing, making sure the piano was ready, that's the job, I know." Sinatra studied him for a moment. "You're going to be with me for a long time, Bill, you know that." "I hope so." Not hope, certainty, because you understand something most people don't. That excellence isn't about talent, it's about standards. And you've got the right standards. He walked out. Miller sat at the piano for a few more minutes. Then he packed up and went home. 15 years later, Bill Miller was still Sinatra's pianist. He'd played on 40 albums, toured the world, been in the room for some of the greatest recordings in American music history. Someone asked him once what it was like working with Sinatra, what separated him from other performers. Standards, Miller said. What do you mean? I mean he never compromised, never settled, never convinced himself that good enough was good enough. I've seen him walk out of sessions because the microphone wasn't right, because the lights were wrong, because something that nobody else would notice wasn't up to his standard. And at first I thought it was ego, perfectionism, but it wasn't, it was respect. Respect for what? For the music, for the audience, for himself. He understood that every time he recorded something, he was creating something permanent, something that would outlast him, and he refused to let anything out into the world that he couldn't be proud of 50 years later. Did he ever compromise? Miller thought about it. Once or twice, early on, before I knew him, but I think he regretted it. I think that's why he was so uncompromising later, because he knew what it felt like to settle, and he never wanted to feel that way again. And the piano, the night he walked out because it was out of tune, Miller smiled. That wasn't about the piano. That was about teaching everyone in that room, me, the producer, the engineer, the orchestra, that we were making something that mattered, that we couldn't phone it in, that if we were going to put Frank Sinatra's name on it, it had to be perfect. And you know what? We never had another session where the equipment wasn't checked twice. We never had another night where someone thought good enough was good enough, because we all learned that night that Frank's standards weren't negotiable, and if you wanted to work with him, you had to meet them. Did you ever resent that, the pressure? Every day, Miller said. But I also never made better music, never pushed myself harder, never felt prouder of what I was part of. So yeah, I resented it sometime, but I wouldn't trade it for anything. Years after Sinatra died, someone found a memo from Voyle Gilmore to the Capitol Records executives, dated March 1957. It read, Sinatra walked out of last night's session because the piano was out of tune. Cost us $12,000 in musician fees with nothing to show for it. Recommend we discuss his behavior at next week's meeting. Below that, someone had written in pen, discussed, agreed that Sinatra was right. All studio equipment to be inspected 24 hours before any Sinatra session. No exceptions. The memo was framed and hung in Studio B at Capitol Records until the building closed in 2006. Nobody knew who A.L. was, but everyone who saw the memo understood what it meant. It meant that sometimes the most important thing you can do isn't to finish the work. It's to refuse to start until the work can be done right. The question is this. When you show up at 2 in the morning to a recording session, knowing the piano is out of tune, knowing you're going to walk out, knowing you're testing your pianist to see if he'll stand up for what's right even when it's easier to compromise, is that leadership? Or is that manipulation? Because you're not just teaching a lesson, you're putting someone's job on the line to prove a point. And when that person passes your test and stays with you for 15 years and makes some of the greatest music of his life, did you help him become better? Or did you just make sure he'd always be afraid of disappointing you? Because maybe there's no difference between high standards and impossible expectations. Maybe they're just the same thing seen from different angles. And maybe that's why people who worked with Sinatra for decades still talked about him with a mixture of reverence and exhaustion. Because excellence is expensive, and the price isn't just money or time. It's the constant fear that no matter how good you are, it might not be good enough. And the terrible part is that fear is exactly what makes the work great. So you can't resent it even when you want to, because without it you'd just be playing a piano that's slightly out of tune and telling yourself nobody would notice. And maybe that's the real question, not whether Sinatra was right to walk out that night, but whether the $12,000 and the sleepless nights and the 15 years of pressure were worth what they created. And the answer is yes, obviously yes. You can hear it in every recording, but that doesn't mean it didn't cost something. And it doesn't mean everyone was willing to pay it.